Dave, super excited for this conversation today.
Hi, Derek. Are we ready to talk about good old New England? The leaves falling,
Absolutely.
The maple syrup dripping, the direct democracy and town halling.
That's exactly what is happening right now in July. Here in Wisconsin, it was 100 degrees yesterday. Feels like the deep, deep South. So long way from leaves changing, maple syrup, etc., but not from annual budget meetings or town halls.
Right. So today we're talking about Addison Central School District in Vermont, which is in the Middlebury area. So if people are familiar with Middlebury College, we're talking about the part of Vermont that has that sort of conurbation in there. But Addison Central is different than North Addison. But also when you look at Addison Central, it's actually a constellation of towns, small towns, and Middlebury sort of being the biggest of them, obviously. But like they're pretty small towns where everyone kind of knows each other. There's a lot of space, not a lot of housing, and each town has a school, and the schools go through different ages and stuff, and all of these towns, which have different names than Addison, none of them are named Addison.
Yeah, of course.
Of course. There's Bridport. There's Middlebury. Today we're talking about a place called Cornwall, which has an elementary school. So maybe I'll read the request to get us started. So let's see. Through my form on TikTok, I got a request. The request says, the district, now this is Addison Central District. The district is facing elementary school closures. The governor is aggressively pushing to consolidate school districts. The state is restricting bonds and capping spending, essentially forcing old schools into disrepair, thereby making them targets for closure and consolidation. Our school, Cornwall, is in the crosshairs. Governor insists that combining districts will lead to savings and promote equity. What do you think of this mess? So that's the request that came in, and I did post a little video on TikTok in advance, and I got a bunch of comments. There was a really interesting reaction, but maybe we should sort of jam on this situation. You know, what we're sort of familiar with, what it means, what's going on in Vermont, and particularly what's happening with Cornwall here in Addison School District. Did you want to talk maybe about some of the state dynamics first, or?
Let's talk about that. So one of the common knocks against the public education system in the United States is that it is so decentralized. 13,000 school districts, tons of local control, very difficult to keep things moving in the same direction. And at the state level, there's 50 states that have ultimate say over what happens in any given district, and they have been kind of loath to exercise a great deal of authority traditionally. I'm describing like the background of what leads to No Child Left Behind and the federal government coming in to put a little bit more pressure on states to align things in particular ways. But within or across states, I should say, there's a lot of regional similarity. And in New England especially, states come out of a certain approach, common approach to public schooling and the meaning of the public in that construct. Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, really similar systems in which the state does, take a very hands-off role when it comes to determining what happens in any local district, but a very hands-on role when it comes to resourcing those districts. So in Vermont, up until Act 73, which was just recently enacted, the general approach was every local school district basically looked around, decided what it was going to do educationally, figured out how much it was going to cost, and then sent that upwards to the state level.
Right.
And the state then sets a tax regime that will fund each and every school district without a lot of well, does that seem like a good idea just in general to do? Very little of that. It's much more a matter of, it's an approach to sort of local democracy in which decisions made in one place have material impacts on people who
Yeah,
lived someplace totally different. And the default is just, okay, we got you. We will supply your needs. That's the assumption. And it works that way for everyone.
that's right. And it's, I mean, so far as I know, this is, I think, the vestiges. It's much diluted from its original form, which happened in 1998 through a state Supreme Court case called Brigham that was handed down, to say that, like most of these other cases, most school funding, the reason why states have been funding more and more per pupil expenditures in this country is because the sort of echoes of the civil rights movement went
Yes.
state by state, and there have been state constitutional cases where there are clauses in each state constitution that says, you got to provide whatever it is, education. You have to provide education. The clauses differ from state to state, because the federal government said because the word education doesn't appear in the Constitution,
Yes,
they don't have
yes.
any responsibility for it. And many states have had these cases, but Vermont, you never know what's going to happen as a result of that. And it could be nothing, but it also could be amazing. And in the case of Vermont, you had what I think is the most amazing system that was put in place, the rudiments of which have withstood the test of time and many challenges since 1998. But it's also like it makes people really mad because we live in an individualist country. But like this basics, what you're saying, is like, in Act 60, what they decided to do was actually not what happens in most other states, which is like school districts. It's like dog eat dog. Okay. It's like, we actually don't share a society. We actually don't share space with one another. We're actually not neighbors. Like you just get whatever you can get from the property value within your boundaries. And that's yours, and you don't have to share it at all. And that actually is one of the very deep kind of metaphysical roots of the problems with school funding in the country. And the state Supreme Court, the judge named Meeker, he gave the best line in I think case law that I'm aware of, which is he said that local control is a cruel illusion.
Wow.
Because you don't have control unless your private property is valuable.
Yep.
Right? Like if you don't have a lot of money, you don't have control. You could be local.
Right.
You could be local all you want, but you still don't have control. It's only the places that have a lot of money with their private property that's valued highly and thus could be taxed at a certain rate to be able to get a lot of money. So he was like, this is bananas. Like you have to fix this. And what they decided to do was put in a system that actually does take up and take on the sort of local controlled private property relations that are so endemic to almost every school district we have in the country. And the way that they do it is what you said, like, but what the state does is the state says that every school district has to tax at a minimum threshold.
Yes.
That's the common level of appraisal, the CLA. Mm-hmm. So for people in Vermont, if you ever want to know what a CLA is when the state comes in and says you got to tax above a certain level. You can't have your tax rate, your mill rate, the amount of dollars you're taking per $1,000 of housing, of real estate value, property value. Like you can't just keep it on the floor and get a ton of money because you have a bunch of wealthy people there in a ski town or something. Like,
that's right.
And you have to have a common level. Okay, so that's a high floor. But then they set a sort of ceiling of per pupil expenditure that they have calculated at the state level is appropriate for your student population, which is weighted. So if you have students who are well-resourced, who are ahead of the game, who don't have a ton of needs, or aren't living in poverty, etc., you can't go and spend a ton per pupil and, get like a second planetarium or whatever.
Right.
And so what the state then does is whatever's left over from your tax base, it just takes it and redistributes it. Okay.
Yep.
And that's they called it Marxism gone wild.
Sure.
At the time when it was passed, they slashed it, like the rich towns, like they would slash the tires of the people who were bringing the court case. They tied ropes on the state roads to try to mess with, people because they didn't want to. They called the receiving towns shark towns.
Oh my God.
And like one of my favorite anecdotes is like the author John Irving, who writes very quaint New England novels. at the time he had his kids in the public school, but he was like, you know, I don't want there to be trailer park envy, and he pulled
Right.
them out of that
That's right.
school, and he made his own private school using his own book money, which I think subsequently he apologized for, because I think that's pretty heinous. But essentially, what this does is it addresses the issue of property value, and the places that have low property value, actually their schools are in good shape. They're in better shape.
That's
Um,
right.
and I don't know if people in Vermont know what they have, right? Like, I don't know if they really appreciate how awesome that is, I think.
I mean, very specifically, like the thing that strikes me as really unique about Vermont and New England a little bit more generally, but especially Vermont since 1998, is really the idea that you at the local level get to determine how much you're going to spend on education, and the state plays a role in making that a reality without a ton of checks. Various states have developed something like the plan that or the approach to funding that you just described, in which there's a foundation, that a floor that is
Foundation aid, yeah.
determined by the state that the local needs to contribute, but there's also a ceiling such that, like, if a district hits that ceiling just with local money, they don't get additional
They
state
don't
money,
get
and in
additional
fact they
state
will
money,
take it.
right.
Yeah.
Those are the
Then, like,
foundation,
that's great. Yeah.
aid formula. That's much more common. What's
Yeah.
much more common is after one of these Supreme Court cases, the state comes together and say, we're going to have a
Yep.
basic foundation aid formula, and it's going to maybe be weighted, maybe not. And if you don't need it, you're not going to get it. But if you do need it, you'll get some. But the problem
That's
with
right.
those situations is that the places that do need it don't get enough. It
That's
still
right.
doesn't compensate, okay? And a lot of the right wingers, they say, oh, how could you keep talking about private property? That's not the
That's
problem
right.
anymore. The
That's
state
right.
governments are compensating for this. Don't be stuck in 1960. But the issue is that it has been. So if you look at state funding for education over the last 50 years, it's a huge line upwards. But
Yeah.
but listen, they need more. They're not getting enough, and a lot of these state governments, particularly in the neoliberal period, have been very ungenerous, very stingy.
That's exactly right. It's a huge line upward, but it was too low to start with. And as much as the line is going up, it's still not enough to keep up with actual needs, either from the rate of inflation or from additional student needs,
deindustrialization,
exactly.
Unemployment, increased health needs, the legacies of racism and Jim Crow and all the sort of ravages of racial capitalism. Like, it's just not enough, and it's not enough, because the places that do have very high property value that don't take that state money are, if you were going to track their lines, they would be way above. They would be way up here, comparatively. Now some like kind of neoliberal and right wingers are going to say, oh my God, these cities with poor kids and they're spending so much per pupil and da 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 da.
Right.
But these are very sort of misleading averages that don't take into account the kinds of needs that these students have, special education funding and the like.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, we're sort of drifting from Vermont, of course, but I think it is super important to just kind of remember that, like, this system is really cool. And they called it Robin Hood, and it is. I mean, it's one of the few actually existing decentralized redistributive systems that we have now. It's a little more centralized than some others, in the sense that the state government takes on this role. But what's going on in Vermont, and what this requester is kind of asking about, is the situation where they've been trying to change that. And Act 73 was the big law, and it was going to overhaul this. So there have been tax revolts in Vermont since the pandemic. People have not been able to afford, or they have been mad about the amount of taxes that they're paying, and they're taking it out on the schools. And as we know historically from tax revolts, a lot of this anger is misplaced. There was a comment on the TikTok that I made that was like, the problem is healthcare expenses.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with your taxes, okay? It has nothing to do with the school funding system. The healthcare costs are out of control. What you need is a sort of Medicare for all system, and then you're going to see your costs go down municipally. But in any case, there have been these tax revolts. They want tax reform. They target education, and it was going to dismantle the system, make it more typical with that foundation aid sort of arrangement that we just made. But ultimately, they were not able to do it. But some reforms did Some reforms did, in fact, remain from the debates around Act 73.
That's exactly right. Act 73 is part of a larger response to the fact that property taxes have been rising everywhere nationally, partly in order to maintain some of the public property taxes for education in particular have been rising everywhere, partly to maintain and take over as funding sources for COVID era federal investments
Right.
that were being made. So a lot of people saw school districts be able to offer things that they want all of a sudden because there was this infusion of ESSER dollars, basically. And then every district, when that money went away in 2023, faced a decision. And those decisions are still being faced. That's part of what Addison Central is dealing with as well.
That's right. Can I just add a footnote
Yeah,
here? That
absolutely.
literally yesterday I saw a National Bureau of Economic Research paper come out that showed that wait, this is you. You sent it to me.
Yes, I sent this to you.
You texted. Oh my God! Of course, Derek gets his flowers because he messaged me on Blue Sky and sent me the link to the NBER paper that basically said that what districts were doing was like they get these ESSER dollars and then they'd lower their taxes, right? So
Yes.
okay, so like when people say, it always sounded a little fishy to me, frankly. It's such an easy thing to say if you're having a deficit crisis in your school district to be like, well, we were getting all this ESSER money. Now it's not there. So we're in a big problem. But like actually what was going on was people were reducing their tax rates because of this revenue coming in from the federal government. So people saw maybe a bit more savings there. And coming out of the pandemic, obviously it hit them like a wall. It hit them like they hit a wall with that. So now in Addison, how is all of this affecting Addison, specifically Cornwall?
Yeah.
Well, what you have here, and another issue, another aspect to this is demographics. Now, one thing that leadership does say, and that you cannot ignore, you can't say that it's not true, that student enrollments are decreasing. They're just fewer students, and this is a problem I think we're going to see every place we go. It's happening almost everywhere except some Sunbelt places where people are moving, I guess, for like lower taxes and having a bunch of babies. Who knows? But also those places happen to be like, right in the crosshairs of climate disaster. So good luck to you. But in this situation of declining enrollment, the problem with declining enrollment is that these state calculations are always based on your attendance. And that's another key formula, another key variable in the formula for this redistributive system, right? You have to submit the number of students that you have. And when your number of students goes down, so does your funding. And when your school in enrollment decreases to such a degree that it's sort of like, do we even need the school at all? Shouldn't these kids go somewhere else? You have 46 kids in a school or whatever. Maybe you just close that school and then send them other places, particularly if it's just 15 minutes down the state road.
That's right.
In Vermont. Now, in Addison, what you're seeing is a case like this. In particular, now the issue in Cornwall specifically, and this requester, I want to keep saying caller as though they're calling in, but they're not calling. But I want to say calling. They're worried that they're going to close the school in Cornwall, the elementary school in Cornwall. Now, I happen to understand from research that this school is actually not in great shape. It's not. It's sort of falling apart, as the caller mentions, right? Disrepair, and there's a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that the state, the Vermont Bond Bank, is largely responsible for providing resources for bonding and going into debt and then taking care of your facilities, because that's how school districts finance facilities, is through debt.
That's right.
On Wall Street. And the state has become like, these two tracks I think are really important to sort of tease out. Like, the revenue that a school district gets per pupil from a state source is very different than the revenue is very different in terms of expenditure. That's an operating expense. You're going to use that money to pay your teachers. But for your building, it's a totally different avenue. Okay. It's going to be coming from a totally different direction. And the state of Vermont has become less generous over time in the kind of capital expenditure revenue that's coming in. So it's like, these buildings are falling apart. Now, it's interesting that the sort of caller is saying like, well, this is happening on purpose because they want to close the schools.
Exactly.
They're letting them fall into disrepair. I believe that. It sounds a little conspiratorial. I mean, like, do you, if you're, in Vermont, you're a Republican governor with a Republican administration in a fairly progressive state, think to yourself, well, I want to close down schools, so I'm going to defund them? Not really. But you don't want to. What you want to do is lower people's taxes, and you want government to be smaller, and so you slowly decrease the amount of revenue that's going to be coming in for capital expenditure. But also, if your town, Cornwall, like, isn't going to do a bond by itself, or Addison doesn't want to do a bond, or whatever, like, and people don't want to pay up extra tax for that, then the building's just gonna fall apart. So the question then becomes, what do you do? Do you close Cornwall? You don't have enough students in there. And Act 73 has a clause in it that did survive called small by necessity versus small by choice. And the state government's going to start coming in and putting pressure on communities who don't need to be small in their school populations to close those schools. And the last thing I say, and I'm going on and on, but the last thing I'll say about this is that I think people in Vermont, in these towns, small as they are, and perhaps as low as the enrollment might be, they want a school in their town because the sense, the vibe that people have, even though they're older, they're retired, they're millionaires. In the case of Cornwall, very wealthy town. They don't want a town that doesn't have a school because they feel it makes the town less attractive. Now, your town should have a school, they think to themselves. But why are they interested in that? They don't want their property value to go down.
That's right.
They think the school's presence increases the value of their asset. Okay, the home voter hypothesis.
Why would they think that? Just because that's been true for 250 years in the United States?
Is it because we fund public education through private property? Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. So the sort of the ontological relationship between the value of an asset through home ownership, which configured by the 30-year mortgage, when Democrats were afraid of a Bolshevik style revolution after the Great Depression, people end up having this relationship with the public school. It's actually the value of their private property. Literally, those things are two sides of the same coin. And so people in Cornwall are like, don't close our school. It's going to hurt our property values. But they don't. Do they care about the school, qua school, in terms of I don't know. I asked them.
And not to stay with the Marxist theory for too much, but but I mean, I'll just say that in addition to being two sides of the same coin, nobody thinks of it. Well, very few people think of it as like, I don't want my property values to fall. They'll be like, I don't want the quality of the community life to deteriorate. Yes. I don't want people to move away. What we're talking about is an ideological mystification that bottoms out in property value. What we're talking about is effects that are bound up in this property value relation. It is possible for me to imagine a different kind of world in which we don't fund schools exactly this way. And so, having kids in your community attend a school that's 15 minutes down the road is not the death knell for a community, but that isn't the world in which anyone has any experience with here. And so it's not It's not crazy, and it's not necessarily miserly for people to be like, no, I don't want my community to die, so we need a school in this town, even if I am not thinking of it as an educational institution in this exact sense.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a ton of like really interesting dynamics here. Like, you could imagine a world in which, and this is something that comes from William Fischel, who wrote the home voter hypothesis, which is a very interesting text. I don't agree with him, but it's a very interesting text. He says, for instance, if there was a home value insurance program, imagine you could purchase an insurance policy that said that if your property value were to fall by thus degrees, the insurance will make you whole on your asset. How different would people feel about the provision of public goods in this municipal context? It might change their own calculations when they go to vote for things or when they advocate for certain kinds of policies, like keeping a school open or not.
Yes,
but also, like, if you uncoupled or you decoupled the public school provision from private property in this way, you wouldn't have the same connection. the example I always go to in terms of my like fantasy is Yugoslavia, right? Like you have social ownership of the means of production, and you actually have school
That's right.
communities
Yeah.
that that are made up of workers, both teachers in the schools, community members, but also people who are working in the industries of that region, who then kind of negotiate with the larger,
Yeah.
in this case, sort of regional government for what their budget should be, and they're sort of negotiating this contract. And ultimately, like it's the decision of the sort of collectively self-managed firms and their communities to be able to appropriate monies. Like that's a different calculation. Like it's just a different set of incentives than this
That's
system.
also not terribly unlike what Vermont's got at pre-Act 73, honestly.
I know. It's like, I don't know. I think people should, I really hope people of Vermont, you don't get rid of the system, because it's a light unto nations, so to speak.
Here's another footnote. I was like, oh my God, I've read about this Yugoslavia situation someplace relatively recently. Where did I read it? And then I'm like, oh, it was your book. I read it in your book.
What else talks about Yugoslavian school finance? Yeah. But, there's a couple other things that I think are interesting to point to here. So one thing is
let me pull back.
No, go ahead.
Let me do one more thing on this idea about declining enrollment and the way that it puts two different kinds of pressures on schools. You brought up the difference between operational funding and sort of capital revenue streams
OpEx
that you get
and
through
CapEx.
bonding. Yeah. This is something that I see communities struggling with everywhere to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two factors here. The first thing is, because operational revenue is conditioned on the number of students that are enrolled in a district, it is very as enrollment starts to decline, it gets relatively more expensive to operate schools. That is, on a per pupil basis, you have to spend more to keep to maintain the level of offerings that you have.
Yep.
Period. You're spending more per pupil because you can't necessarily cut, just because. Okay, let's take this. I was thinking about this in the shower for some reason this morning.
Well, the best place.
Let's say you've got a school district
finance,
of like
political economy.
Yeah, exactly. Let's pretend you've got a district of 1,300 kids. That's not actually all that different from ASCD that we're talking about here. 1,300 kids. Let's say that they are funded at $10,000 per pupil. These just nice round numbers, and you've got 100 kids evenly distributed across kindergarten to 12th grade.
Yeah,
100 kids per grade level. $10,000 per pupil is a $13 million budget. Okay, let's say you lose 130 kids in a given year, but evenly 10 kids per grade level. Now you have lost $1.3 million in operating revenue.
It just goes way down.
But $1.3 million in operating revenue is roughly 13 teachers, one per grade level.
Yeah.
Can you really cut a teacher if you have gone from 100 kids in a grade level to 90? Like, let's say you had 25 kids in every fourth grade class, evenly distributed.
You need that teacher.
Absolutely.
You need
so
that
suddenly,
teacher. Those kids need
you
that
have
teacher.
lost $1.3 million in revenue. But if you want to continue to provide the same kind of education, you effectively have to keep spending $13 million to do it. And that means your per pupil expenditures have to rise. That's how declining enrollment affects operating budgets.
Yeah.
You lose money, but you have to struggle to be able to provide the same educational opportunities. And it feels like the district must be doing something wrong. But no, it's funding is pegged to enrollment. Yeah.
It's the culprit here is per pupil expenditure, right? Like just because you have a slight decrease in the dumb number of kids, right? Just like there's no subtlety there at all. It's just, do you have kid or not? That decreases your funding. It's like, no, it's like we still have kid. Like we still have the other kid.
We still have kid.
We still have kid. We still have kid. Like it doesn't mean we don't need that money. And like our institutions should be, they should be fluid enough. They should be flexible enough to be able to work with demographic shifts. Okay. If the ruling class wants to ruin the economy through derivatives and stuff in 2008, and then that echoes over time into lower birth rates, because who the hell would want to have a kid if you can't afford anything and you're depressed as hell because everything's going or whatever? Like, okay, we should have institutions that should be able to work with that because things fluctuate. Even the very phrase, I was thinking about this, it wasn't in the shower, I can't remember where, but like the phrase baby boom,
Yeah.
right? That's a boom. Like,
Right.
you're not going to, just because there's one baby boom doesn't mean there's going to be successive booms. Like
Right,
there's
right.
going to be a bust or there's going to be
That's
a
right.
decrease, right? You should have institutions that can work with that, right? But we don't
Yeah.
have that. And like, not to harp on the Yugoslavian system, but if each school system were able to negotiate according to the criteria that they were in dialogue were able to generate, they wouldn't have to be hemmed in by this very simple, blunt instrument of the per pupil expenditure. You could negotiate, but
That's right.
we don't have that system.
And that also strangely brings me to the CapEx side of things, the
Yes.
building thing. So per pupil expenditures, whatever. Number of pupils is declining. That puts pressure on operating budgets. That's been happening for a little bit, as well as states in general have been sort of pulling back on their contributions, in Wisconsin in particular, which I will regularly make reference to. I find like revenue limits have not kept up with inflation here. And so districts have constantly been trying to do less. And what that has meant is that districts have taken a portion of the budget, usually like 1% to 2%, that would ordinarily be invested in maintaining buildings and pushing it towards students, towards educating students, to the other operational needs that they have, because they don't want to let the quality of the education that they're offering drop. And they're willing to be like, okay, well, maybe the next budget will be better. Well, maybe the next budget will be better. And in the meanwhile, like the building is still going to keep rain off kids. Yeah.
You have to get through whatever the kerfuffle is at this moment. It's how they're always operating on a yearly cycle of just like, can we get through this? Can we get through this?
I am less, I find myself not really seeing the conspiratorial aspect of like, they want to disinvest in buildings so that they will close. It tends to be like just low hanging fruit after they have made a lot of decisions in response to certain levels of funding. That is year after year of decision not to invest in a building. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, we don't have as many students. Maybe we can close a building. And let me say that there's two ways of looking at this, one from an operational perspective and one from a capital perspective.
Sure.
Because Cornwall is in this situation right now. Districts everywhere are in very similar situations. Going forward, there's two ways of imagining this. Let's imagine that we're just starting a school district from scratch, which no one else is, or which no one is. How many buildings would we build for the number of students we actually have and the number of students that we forecast right now? It's probably fewer than what you actually have. You know, if you were just trying to design a system from scratch. But since no one is actually starting from scratch, what you are talking about is closing school buildings. But closing school buildings does not happen in a vacuum either.
No, it doesn't.
Because from an operational expenditure standpoint, closing buildings hardly saves you anything. If you are going to take all the teachers from building A, which is going to close, and move them from building to building B along with the students so that you are keeping class sizes and offerings relatively consistent, that's the bulk of the salaries. That's the bulk of the expenditures on an annual basis that is devoted to that building. So you're not saving a lot of money. What you will, like, you can cut the principal, you can cut the administrative assistant, you can cut the janitorial staff, and that will save you $150,000, what, $300,000 total?
But you know what it does? It makes it seem like you're saving money.
Exactly.
Because actually the like regime that we've been living under is one where like cutting and firing makes you look efficient.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that makes it look like you're a business person who knows to do the difficult thing.
Exactly. I was going to say making the tough call.
Tough call, right? We're going to cut, we're going to fire and close. And that's what I know, it's painful, but that's what needs to happen. And you know, like, no, like for that formulation to work, this situation would actually have to help, and it never does. Okay, public provision of education is not the same thing as running McDonald's franchises in a county. It's not. It's not. It's really not. But Milton Friedman, you know, he when designing the voucher system that's now becoming ascendant in this country, his imagination was that schools were like restaurants. But like that's not what this is. And one of the other costs, you know, that comes up, particularly in places like Vermont, is transportation. Because when you close a school and you're miles away from the next school, your kid has to ride the bus. Okay. And
Yep.
they didn't have to ride the bus before. Maybe they could walk, or they could take a quick car trip, or the bus ride was shorter. But now you have to have longer bus trips, more fuel costs, more what's the fancy word for when your infrastructure depreciation of your
Depreciation.
fleet,
Yeah.
and that goes up. It's like, I always think about how in I can't was it Robert Caro and Robert Moses and stuff. It's like, if you build
Yes.
another lane, if you build another
Yeah.
highway next to the highway you have, there's going to be as much traffic as there was when you had that first highway. It's just closing the
Exactly.
school, it's not going to make it. It's a difference that does not make a difference. Even
Part of
though
what makes it
it's
really
very killing.
hard for local communities to get their heads around this is that all the numbers that should be on both sides of the ledger are not there. So like, you'll talk about like cost savings from salaries, but you won't be talking about like expenditure additions from fuel or depreciation or that kind of stuff.
It doesn't math.
It doesn't math as well as people think. But, and here's where we get to the CapEx part. And this is the situation that a lot of districts, including Addison Central with Cornwall, are in. There's an opportunity cost element suddenly, because now you've got a building that needs a lot of investment.
Yep.
And so the decision to close, it's not simply on an operational annual basis that we're talking about savings. No. It's about, do we put $60 million into this building in order to keep it shipshape, or do we just cut our losses? This discourse too is constantly polluted by bad numbers, in which people who want to close a school will constantly be like, well, we can just sell the building for X dollars.
Right.
It never sells for as much as you think it will.
It just sits
never,
there.
ever.
I mean, there's so many school buildings in this country just sitting there rotting. They thought that they could be sold, and
exactly.
What, they were going to turn into condos? I mean, what are you going to do? You're gonna, I mean, some school districts, I've seen cases, where they sell a part of the district office to a dentist. Okay, fine. Or a community college, but it's just the revenue that
there's
you're going to make
of districts. There's a ton of districts around me right now who have closed buildings and then sold them to voucher companies or independent charters. And I'm like, oh, good. So now you're eating into your enrollment further. Like, this is
and you're eating. Oh, that's awful. I mean, then you're eating your per pupil stuff. I mean, but the other angle of this demographic problem, and which comes up when you look at places like Cornwall and Addison in the Addison district, is like, okay, let's say we have decreasing student body, right? And you want to keep your school. I definitely tend to think that schools should be kept. Like, not necessarily because I think they're going to increase the value of my asset, but because I think it's public provision. And also school buildings are community hubs. Like, when there's a climate crisis, when there's a heat wave, when there's a blizzard, when there's an earthquake, when there's a fire, people will go to the school building. Okay. They know where that building is. And more as these climate catastrophes increase, people know to go to those school buildings because they have space, because there's infrastructure there. Like, I think that that's important for public provision, generally speaking. And this is also a point that before, when you said polluted and thinking about the investment in the school building, it's like, it's not just whether we should spend $60 million on the school building, but like, could we decarbonize this public infrastructure?
That's right.
Not put as much carbon in the atmosphere. School buildings are just number 2 behind transportation school buildings in general emit the second amount of most carbon, and school buildings do a ton of emitting carbon, and it's an opportunity to decrease carbonization. But what I was going to say was like, okay, let's say you want to keep your school. What do you think? What do you think to yourself to do? Okay. And one of the problems is declining enrollment. Let's say the state of Vermont is coming after you because you're small by choice. And you say, well, we're going to have to close you down. We're going to have to send you to Ripton. We're going to have to send your kids to another. I'm looking at these other towns. Bridport, not Bridgeport. Bridport.
Exactly.
And, like, I'm from New England. I'm from Connecticut, so I'm from I know Bridgeport. I think Bridgeport. But like, okay, so how do you solve this problem? Now, I think everyone right now, all the demographers and economists too, are like, why are birth rates decreasing? Like, why is the replacement rate why are we not hitting this number of babies? Why? It's bad. It's happening all over the world. It's not just the United States. Right. It's not just Vermont. It's everywhere. Everyone's dealing with this problem. And nobody really knows why exactly when they try to use the very
Mhm.
advanced statistical methods. You can have your theory, like my pet
Yeah,
theory
yeah,
is that
yeah.
it's the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of people think it's cell phones now.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Whatever you think,
Yeah.
right? Like climate, people think it's climate anxiety, economic
Yeah.
anxiety. It's like a nice little Rorschach for whatever, your pet issue might be. But the problem here is actually, how do you create a political economy in Cornwall if you want to keep your school to be able to increase the number of students that are going to that school? Okay.
Mhm.
Now, what that would take is actually, you have to look at your entire social structure. And you have to focus on housing, for one, and the cost of housing specifically. How much does it cost to move to Cornwall? How much does it cost to buy a house there? I had a comment in the TikTok that said, I could never afford to live in Cornwall.
Uh-huh.
That was someone who went to that elementary school, and they
Yeah,
said, I
yeah.
could never afford to live there now. And so how do you think about housing affordability in Cornwall if to try to entice people to move there? Well, one thing you might have to think about is the size of your plats, the size of your land distribution.
Mhm.
Like maybe people shouldn't have acre big lawn, like 8 acres
Yeah.
to themselves.
Mhm.
Maybe they don't need that. Maybe you have higher density. Okay, so
Mhm.
being socialist or whatever, I like to think of density. Okay, if you have density and then you bring down the cost for people, and then they can move there. Okay, but a lot of times to also preserve their town in the same calculation as they want to keep their school for their property value, they also don't want affordable housing because they don't want, quote,
Exactly.
those people coming into their
Yes.
town that would also decrease the value of their property, but also not just the value of the property, but the vibe. Okay, they want their
Right.
bourgeois vibe. Okay, and you gotta take that head on, right? You have to find
Mhm.
a way of dealing with that. I haven't seen necessarily anybody who's come up with a proposal that like would address this, and that
Yeah.
it has worked in the situation, but you have to get thinking creatively, which is what I tell the people of Cornwall. You want people to come, you gotta make it so that they can come afford to have kids, and you're gonna want to make it so that they want to have their kids there and raise them.
That's right. And generally, it's like there's historical associations between public amenities like schools and parks and whatever, and you get like in terms of attracting people who have kids who will put those in the public schools. Those also come at the expense of housing density. So like these conversations get easier the larger your community is. They're like Madison, Wisconsin, a couple of years ago passed just like the municipality and the school district passed these massive tax hikes, and people's property taxes actually fell because
How
the
about that?
computer system that every medical professional uses, Epic, is based in Madison and is hiring like out the wazoo. And so they're
Yeah,
just building all these high rise apartments in
right.
Madison. So the division of property gets smaller and smaller. People's individual chunks of responsibility for providing those numbers keep shrinking even as property taxes go up. But in smaller communities, it means that like it hits people
Yeah.
differently. You're not building vertically necessarily. You are shrinking the horizontal amount of space that people have eh, that people can enclose effectively.
Yeah.
The other big thing, if I were in Cornwall and I wanted to keep a school open, is to think about the difference between what a capital expenditure means in terms of a property tax hit and what an operating expenditure means. Again, you are not looking at saving operational dollars on a very significant scale by closing a building on a year-over-year basis. And people will throw around a big number. I don't know what the proposed number is for repairing Cornwall, but let's just say $60 million. People will be like, my God, well, you don't want to spend $60 million just to preserve this under-enrolled school.
Yeah.
And the idea is that like you're not really on an annual basis absorbing $60 million in a tax hit to do that work. You're essentially taking out a mortgage on that refurbished building. It will make your taxes go up,
Sure.
but it is nothing compared to the effect of hiring an additional 5 teachers, let's say. Well, it's probably
Well,
actually
yeah, and
equivalent to
it's
that.
hard to, but I think you're right. What's complicated a little, I think that logic is I would say generally correct. What's a little more subtle about the situation is that the people of Cornwall want to keep their school, and the
Exactly.
people of the district are kind of wondering, like, maybe we should close that because it's a bit of a drag on the larger district because they have this kind of constellation
Yes,
formation.
yes, yes.
And so it ends up being that the more forward thinking position in the district context might be to close Cornwall, even though the people of Cornwall might not want that. And so it becomes very difficult. Like if I were in Cornwall, I would start like, speaking of mortgages, what if
Yeah.
you decided as a community to come together and try to figure out how to offer subsidized mortgages for properties in
Yeah.
Cornwall, and then at the same time embark on a kind of on a school repair regime simultaneously. And by the way, just as like there,
Hmm.
and people have cheated the system in Vermont by like putting their own money together and not declaring it to the state to try to do the things that they want to do. Because if they were going to put their own money together, then that would light up on the state's radar, and like
Yeah.
basically the state would then sort of scoop away more to redistribute it.
Yeah.
And so because they
Exactly.
don't want it they don't want it going to their neighbors,
Right.
they do it sort of under the table, so to
Hmm.
municipally speaking. And like, people of Cornwall, please don't do that. Like if you're gonna
Right.
if you're gonna if you're gonna embark on a school repair program, which I think you should, and like I would say, don't do it under the table. Make sure your money might not go to your school. It might not,
That's right.
it might not even go to your district, but it will go to the kids of Vermont who need it because of the amazing system that you have. So in parallel, pursuing a school repair program that I think should be decarbonized. You can
Yeah.
use a green bank to do it, to lower the cost of it. And there's always a green way out of debt, I think. And at the same time, come up with creative ways. Maybe we could lobby the pension funds in Vermont to start offering subsidized mortgages. That's what Singapore did.
Huh.
Singapore pension funds actually, Singapore pension funds started organizing singles events for people to meet because they needed to increase their population. The reason why the pension fund was organizing the singles event was because the pension fund was selling subsidized mortgages at a lower rate because they wanted people to purchase housing to encourage them to
Yes.
have families, but people weren't getting together and falling in love. So they started having singles events. Okay, so we got to start thinking like that. We got to start thinking, here we are in this situation. It's not like it was. And we can't hold on to the past, but we shouldn't just necessarily go with this neoliberal reflex.
That's right.
That is just austerity, right? We can.
Yes. I want to say two things. First, there is a movie in that story about Singapore pension funds.
Yeah. That would be fun.
Like, that is a romantic comedy waiting to be written.
Waiting to happen. Oh my God!
Not by me.
Pension funding romantic comedy.
The second big thing to say is that, like, what Addison Central is experiencing in terms of having an outlying school that needs repair amid declining enrollment, where it totally makes sense on a district level to people who don't live in that community to be like, hey, we should be forward thinking. We can be more economically efficient if we shut this school down. I want to be like, that's only 5 years of forward thinking. That's not thinking big enough.
What about 50 years?
Yeah, every community in the United States, because we're all experiencing the same sort of dynamic. We all have these buildings that are deteriorating. We all live, every district, most districts are made up of a lot of different neighborhood communities and that kind of thing, different neighbors who can see one another differently. This is both a threat to solidarity and also an opportunity to relearn something about what we mean. Like, another community in Addison Central has the opportunity here to be like, well, if this were my school, if my school were the one under consideration for closing, would I want it to be closed? And if the answer is no, man, put up the money. Put up the money right now. Like, increase, do what it takes to keep funding this. Part of what's happening in Vermont with Act 73 is that statewide pressure to take it out of community hands. Partly so that, because as you might imagine, as everyone knows, these fights when it comes to, like, should this particular neighborhood school within a given district close, are never polite affairs. They are
ruthlessly
like dark stuff. So like, it makes some psychological sense from a state perspective and even from like an individual sort of neighborhood perspective to be like, why don't we make this not our decision so we don't have to fight our neighbors hand to hand in order to figure out who gets to keep a school, and the state will just come in and be like, you get to and you don't. We'll just trust the wisdom of Solomon or whatever. At the same
hand to
time,
hand.
exactly. At the same time, however, it is also an opportunity to be like, no, if I were in my neighbor's place, I would want this school to stay. And so I will prefer to pay a higher level of property taxes in order to make that possible so that I may eventually keep my school if I am ever in that position as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like we did it. I'm looking through my notes.
Yeah.
Because this is really about Cornwall. There's stuff about Addison Central, but actually just to sort of provide context here, Addison Central is actually in fine shape. I mean, if there's any deficit, it's less than $100,000. It's and they're doing well. I watched a video of the meeting, the budget guy, can't remember his name, but he seems like he's on top of it. I mean, he himself, to go back to this point, that we sort of started with, like he himself is saying, what's the problem here is healthcare costs.
Yes.
That's what's going to get us. And there's no way for school districts to really plan, particularly with this terrible bill, the second Trump administration passed in the first reconciliation. Like, it's just going to hit so hard. And, I'm thinking like, historically, like there might be tax revolts and there might be this whole wave of reaction. And, it might get written as like, oh, people thought their taxes were too high, but ultimately it was the healthcare costs, that were skyrocketing, and it was sort of displacing the top. So
that's right. We have pretty much done it. I want to like wrap this up with two things, one small detailed thing and one larger, like how to read documents, kind of tip. The sort of small details that one aspect that sort of came up as we were looking through the information on ASCD had to do with the different tax rates that people within the district are paying, because Vermont has, like a lot of states, has property tax reassessments happen, or property value reassessments happen at different times. This can wildly fluctuate rates between districts, and or district communities that serve or that flow into the same district budget. And this can be completely confusing to residents who otherwise have no reason to think about what their neighbor's property tax valuation is. So for instance, in this district in particular, I'm looking at it now, like if we're looking at Bridport, Cornwall, Middlebury, Ripton, Salisbury, I think that's how you say it, Shoreham, and Weybridge, we've got like, if we're looking at projected CLA, projected fiscal year 27 tax rate, fiscal year 26 town tax rate, and the difference between those and the percent change over time, it's like some communities are up like 1% or 9% or 8%, while other communities are down 47%, down 40%, down 37%.
These assessments are all over the place.
Well, what I want to say is like the relationship between property value, anybody's individual property tax bill, and school funding is really complicated. Any community, whether it's Cornwall or Middlebury, Cornwall property like percent change is down 47%. Any community is responsible ultimately for a certain share of school funding in actual dollars. That is like period. That is obviously divided by their total equalized property value, or their total property value number, right? When property is reassessed, generally upward in a community, the amount of money that they are responsible to sending the school remains the same. So what happens is that the percentage, like the tax rate that goes to schools, drops precipitously, even though the money that is being sent to school stays the same. And that's just because the property value has increased. Where people's tax bills individually get affected by that and where people get confused all the time is about the relationship between your property's individual assessment and the like average assessment, like reassessment rate. So
the comparables and the county assessor and the
yes,
it's all about that assessment process. Yes,
we just got reassessed.
So important.
2 years ago.
How'd it go?
Or like the year before last. Overall, the average property in the small city that I live in went up 54%.
Wow,
that's a ton.
That's so
my
much.
Property went up 70%. So because my property value, this house had been underassessed for years. So I'd been saving money on the front end.
You were high on that supply.
And now I'm I'm paying it back, which I am fine with for the record.
But you understand how this works. So you're reconciled to the fact that the increased assessment actually creates more dollars for the municipality that then benefits you and benefits your neighbors and your community.
Exactly.
But it's also important, like in the pandemic, they froze these assessments,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
So people didn't feel it, but it was prolonging this this magic, and people have had to wake up.
So the amount of money that I send to the school district in my property tax bill has gone up considerably, but that is not because my property value has risen, period. It's because my property value rose more than my neighbors. Like my share of the community's property taxes has gone up from where it was before the reassessment happened. So it's not like, and at the same time, even though I'm paying more money to the district, my property tax rate has actually dropped because the assessed value is so much higher relatively.
Because that numerators and denominators, people.
Exactly.
Don't let yourself be mystified. It's someone's trying to pull the wool over your eyes to take advantage of you to get them to vote for something that's actually going to hurt you and everyone else. Please be aware. Stay woke, literally.
The difference, like tax rates are terrible numbers to look at when you're talking about how much money am I sending to the school district. It is like community by community, how much is the community responsible for and what is happening with that number. That's the level at which to think about. And also how much money total is the locality, the school districts, the local residents, how much are they responsible for?
Because ultimately that rate is almost it's a lagging number that comes as a result of the expenditure of the municipality on the provision of services. So it's such that it makes your tax rate actually relative to the value from the value of the property is relative to the expenditure that the community is engaged in. So don't try to keep an eye on this.
And the last thing that I wanted to mention about document reading. So for doing the research for this episode, we were looking at the 26-27 budget book for ASCD, and every district will put something out that is like that. There's a lot of numbers and people will skip the front matter. Don't skip the front matter is the advice. In this one, there is, it opens with a message from the superintendent, followed by a message from the board chair, followed by an executive summary of the general financial section and a strategy section, as well as like fiscal year 27 budget drivers, fiscal year 27 expense modeling for block budgeting, et cetera, summary of changes, and then you get into sort of the real numbers. But all of those framing devices are framing devices. That is where district leaders of various kinds, from the superintendent to the board president to the school business official, whoever that is, has a lot of wiggle room to shape a certain kind of narrative. Whether that narrative is accurate
ultimately.
Is exactly whether that narrative is accurate or like self-serving or whatever, that is a thing for local folks to test. And in this, I'll just say, looking over this particular budget book, in terms of the actual fiscal constraints, it seems pretty right on with what we're seeing everywhere else and in Vermont too. Healthcare is a major driver, et cetera, et cetera. The TikTok requester had asked specifically what we make of the claim that like there are better learning environments or better possibilities for program offerings if you consolidate schools. And like, generally speaking, that's true, but that's also not a bait and switch, but it's also a way of narrowing the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Right.
Narrowing literally narrowing the topics of conversation. We do want to provide robust educational programs for all kids, and it is more possible to do that at scale. That's why we developed comprehensive high schools in like the early 20th centuries.
And that's why all their districts are called consolidated districts or unified districts.
Exactly. It is possible to do this at scale in a way that it isn't possible to do in lots of smaller buildings. But again, coming back to the like mystified ideological connection to property values, it's also not the only thing in the conversation. It's not the only thing that a school does is provide educational program. It also does things for the community. And it's not that like that weights decisions in one direction or another. It's just that everything should be in the conversation. And it is very difficult as a community to keep everything in view all at once or to keep bringing things back to view, because like people who want specific outcomes will tend to emphasize specific things that, you know, seem to point in the direction of those outcomes, period. Yeah. And that's always leaving something out. Be careful of those.
I think that's spot on. It's very helpful for you to unpack it that way.
Awesome. Good luck in Vermont, in the Addison Central Unified School District. Solidarity. Your district looks like it's in good financial shape. It is just like that structural realignment. That's a real decision point. And once the decision is made, then
start thinking creatively too. Start, you know.
Exactly.
Think outside the box.